In 1787, the HMS Bounty left England for the Pacific to collect breadfruit plants, intended as cheap food for Caribbean slaves. The journey took 10 agonizing months. Facing storms and disease, Captain Bligh maintained order by flogging his crew, creating an atmosphere of constant dread. And then they arrived in Tahiti. The contrast was staggering. The men stepped off a wet, violent floating prison onto warm beaches, greeted by welcoming islanders and a level of freedom they had never experienced. For 5 months, the crew lived on the island while the breadfruit plants were prepared. Men who had known nothing but rigid naval discipline, including Bligh's own protégé, Fletcher Christian, became deeply embedded in the local culture, forming relationships and adapting to the island's rhythm. Going from 10 months of extreme confinement and corporal punishment into 5 months of absolute liberty created a psychological trap. When the ship's holds were finally full and the order came to leave, forcing the men back under Bligh's rigid discipline was like trying to force a grenade back together after pulling the pin. 3 weeks into the return voyage, the tension finally boiled over. Bligh noticed some coconuts were missing from the ship's stores. He exploded, zeroing his rage onto Fletcher Christian and humiliating him in front of the crew. That night, Christian snapped. Before dawn on April 28, 1789, he and a group of loyal men stormed the captain's cabin, dragged Bligh from his bed, and forced him onto the deck at knife point. The crew was split. Some wanted to execute Bligh on the spot, but Christian refused. Instead, he forced Bligh and 18 loyalists off the ship and down into a 23-foot open rowboat, handing them a few days' worth of rations. By choosing exile over murder, Christian effectively set up an involuntary test of human extremes. He severed the crew in half, casting 2 groups out into the Pacific to face completely opposite realities. The math of survival was practically zero. 19 men shoved into a 23-foot vessel, rations measured in ounces. And the geography? They sat in the most dangerous waters on Earth. No map, separated from the Dutch port of Timor by 3,600 miles of open ocean. Bligh immediately took absolute command, relying entirely on his memory and the stars. He navigated the tiny, overloaded boat through lethal storms, enforcing a rationing system so strict that men began dropping from starvation, yet he refused to yield an inch of his authority. Against all known odds of nautical science, they made it. Bligh dragged his crew across 3,618 miles of ocean over 47 grueling days, successfully landing at Timor. It remains a staggering feat of navigation. The exact trait that drove his crew to mutiny, his unyielding, rigid demand for absolute order, was the only reason those men survived. Meanwhile, on Track B, Fletcher Christian and the mutineers had control of a fully stocked naval vessel, but they had nowhere to go. Returning to England meant a guaranteed death by hanging. Desperate, they sailed back to Tahiti, taking several Tahitian men and women aboard, some willingly, others kidnapped, before fleeing off the known map. They finally dropped anchor at a tiny, completely uncharted rock called Pitcairn Island. To ensure no one could ever leave, and to hide their location from and burned the HMS Bounty to the waterline in the dead of night. The rest of the world assumed the ship was lost at sea. The mutineers were now entirely alone, free to live out their days in a stolen tropical paradise, far from the reach of the British Navy. The contrast between the 2 crews was absolute. Bligh had total structure, but zero resources. Christian had abundant resources, absolute freedom, and absolutely no laws to govern human nature. That lack of structure poisoned the settlement almost instantly. Without a system to resolve disputes, the mutineers' island utopia quickly began to rot from the inside out. Bitter divides formed between the British sailors and the Tahitian men over land and women. Resentment hardened into paranoia, and paranoia erupted into outright violence. Within a few short years, the paradise became a graveyard. The settlers began hunting each other down. Nearly all of the original mutineers were brutally murdered, either by the Tahitians they had brought along or by their own former crewmates. The ultimate irony of the mutiny was that the absolute, lawless freedom the crew violently stole proved to be vastly more lethal than the unforgiving ocean Bligh was cast into. Nearly 2 decades passed in total silence. Then, in 1808, an American sealing ship happened to spot the uncharted rock of Pitcairn and sent a boat ashore. They expected an uninhabited island. Instead, they found a completely isolated hidden civilization. Out of the original mutineers, only one old man named John Adams was still alive, presiding over a community made up entirely of the mutineers and Tahitians' descendants. The mutiny on the Bounty left behind a permanent study in extremes. One man's rigid tyranny forged a legendary survival story, while another's rebellion birthed a violent, isolated society that miraculously still exists on that same rock today.